I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's later, I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens.
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the world.
Well, my name is Richard Dooling, and I grew up in Nebraska. I was born in Omaha and lived there until I was 18 years old. I went to St. Louis University after that. Eventually, I probably spent half my life in St. Louis, but my wife and I and our 4 kids moved back to Omaha, and most recently in 1993, and we've been in Omaha ever since. So along the way, like many other writers, I've had many different jobs. Too many to list here, but I suppose most significantly, I was a respiratory therapist in intensive care units in both Omaha and St. Louis. And then I eventually went to law school and practiced law again in St. Louis for 5 years before moving back to Omaha. I would particularly say Creighton Prep and the schools I went to in Omaha pretty much formed me. So, but in terms of my writing, my latest book is set in Omaha, the one that comes out this fall, called Bet Your Life. It's kind of an insurance murder mystery. But before that, I had a short story set there that was published in the New Yorker in 1994 called Bush Pigs. It was about a guy who came back to Omaha from being a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa. But otherwise, this book coming up in the fall is the first book I've really set there. Well, my father was a huge reader. He read every night and for hours, and my mother, of course, encouraged us all to read. There were 9 kids in my family, and almost everyone is a big reader. As I say, I went to Catholic schools, St. Cecilia's Cathedral, and then Creighton Prep. And all along the way, of course, my teachers going clear back to grade school, Mrs. Pryor, and the various Jesuits who taught me at Creighton Prep and taught me to love literature. It was never even actually my best subject. I did better at science, and especially science, but English I wasn't especially good at. I just really loved to read. So, and then going on to college, there are 2 or 3, again, Jesuits down in St. Louis who had a profound influence upon me. Again, mainly in literature, but also in art history. I took a lot of art history. I think the first time I started writing was at Creighton Prep in Omaha. I was probably sophomore or junior year, and I started just wondering when I read stories and novels, you know, could I do this? If I saw a sentence that I really admired, I would maybe try and write my own sentence, you know, on the same topic. It was kind of involuntary. I just kind of took it up as a hobby, started keeping notebooks and so on. I don't think I really said to myself, boy, I'm going to be a writer until college. I won a big short story contest at St. Louis U my junior year. And so when I won that and all my teachers enjoyed that story, I started thinking, you know, gee, maybe I could make a living doing this, because I was incredibly naive. So I just sort of started, at that point, I planned on being a writer. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into. I got out of college. I was mailing stories to the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker, and they're all coming back in the mail. And so, but I suppose that's when I first started thinking I might be able to be a writer. Fell into it along the way without really thinking about it. And then, yes, after college, I could certainly detect an urge to write, whether I wanted to or not, and I would arrange my life so that I could do it by taking jobs that I could forget about when I wasn't there, and then go home and write, or even look forward to those 3 or 4 day weekends when I could write or read or work on vocabulary or any of the ancillary tasks you do as a writer. But in terms of a need to write, I think sometimes people, and at least in my case, there was at least one time where I said, okay, that's it, I'm going to quit. And that's really the best way to find out if you're a writer, a real writer, is to try and quit. It's kind of the opposite of being an alcoholic, I guess, because if you try and quit writing, in my case, I quit writing. I went to law school, and I said that's it, because I was tired of not getting published, not making money, and so I knew I could make money as a lawyer, and I knew I would be good at the law because so much of it is reading and writing. So I told myself I'm going to quit. Well, I ended up on the Law Journal, which is writing, and the first thing when I got out of law school and started working at the firm, the same thing started happening on vacations and so on. I would dig out the old manuscript. At that time, I think it was Critical Care. I would dig that out and wonder to myself if I could make this into something that I could publish. And so, in fact, I wasn't successfully able to quit. But I'm also a believer in doing many different kinds of writing, and really the work I did for the firm was writing briefs and motions for summary judgment or motions in opposition to summary judgment, and that's every bit as artful. People don't like to hear that, but I believe it. And fortunately, I had the kind of clients that would let you write a really good brief and pay you for it. So, and I like that kind of writing. I still do. I don't think of it that way. It's kind of like a fish in the water. You just start doing it. And in fact, I kind of discourage people from trying to force themselves to write. It's more something that you should do because you love it or don't do. And if you have some other reason for doing it, things probably won't turn out well in the long run. So I don't really feel inspired. I just feel it's something that I do, like a runner runs or stockbroker trades stocks. What drew those people? What inspires them? I don't necessarily, again, consciously gravitate to any particular theme or issue, but certainly my faith seems to crop up a lot, even if I begin the book by saying, okay, I'm not going to have anything about Catholicism in here this time because it's getting old and I've already done it so many times, and yet it somehow kind of creeps up no matter what. I would also say that a recurring theme in my writing is the struggle of science against human nature, which is everywhere in society. I write a lot about computers, medical science, neuroscience, and brainstorm, and the effect those have on the human person, and again, somebody who is a person of faith, struggling against often people of no faith who are just pure scientists. So that would be a favorite recurring theme, I think. Well, in terms of my writing habits, I really, if I'm I call it either being in a project or not in a project. And as I get older, I tend to be more in a project almost all the time. And when I'm in a project, I write almost all the time, 10 or 12 hours a day even. And then I would tend to finish that project or reach a breaking point in the project and then take several days off to pay my taxes and, clean the office and that kind of thing. So I don't really have a certain time of the day that I write. It would be almost all the time when I'm in the middle of something. And that's why novels tend to be, if you're going like that for a year or so, it's probably not healthy, and it's hard on your family life too. But a short story or something, a week or two, you're just, typing all the time, and then there's 3 or 4 days off when you start thinking about your next project, or your galley proofs from the last book come in, and then you proofread those. There are a lot of other chores that you do besides just writing, especially rewriting, as we all know. Well, your voice as a writer is really you. and your characters are all you too. And so when you're young, you have a young person's view of the world, and as you get older, hopefully you're wiser and able to have more range in your voice and your characters, do more different kinds of characters. That's why I think, how many coming-of-age novels have we had? Because that's the easiest thing to write when you're first starting out, 21, 22, because it's just what happened to you. I tend to like to write about things that happened to me 10 years ago because it gives me more perspective on them, and I can look back at myself and everyone else and see them in a more objective light. I'm not the type of person that has something happen to them and then I run home and write about it. I'm usually writing about something that happened a long time ago. So, but yes, your voice, I mean, that's what it means to be a writer. If you're a good writer, you succeed in putting yourself on the page, Well, that's kind of a complicated question. Obviously, people, when I'm writing, I am writing for other people, but I'm really, when I'm trying to decide what to write, I'm thinking about what would I like to read, or what would I like to happen next, what would interest me if I was reading. Because in fact, when you get into, I think of it as a trance almost, when I like to have it really quiet and no phones or anything like that, and you do sort of get into a trance. And it is almost as if you're reading instead of writing, so you're trying to make words that would interest you. And then, of course, you're going to go back later and redo them and so on. But I guess if there's one thing I've changed as I've, done this longer, I go faster now through a first draft instead of being a brick-by-brick type person. And I think the story will cohere better that way. And then you can go back later and fuss over it if you want. So I would have weeks at a time where I would just type and not ever go back and look at it, and then later come back and do that. But when I was young, it was every sentence had to be perfect before I went to the next one. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're just different ways of, and also the older I get, I like to try different things. I like to try a horror story or a funny story, a dramatic story. I might even try a sad one someday. I'm trying to write something for them that we would both enjoy to read, and that's usually a story, a good story. There's a famous quote, somebody in Hollywood, one of the early big mega producers, had a pretty good quote about movies or screenplays that tend to want to send a message about something. And he said, if you want to send a message, you should use Western Union. And I've always agreed with that, because a good work of art or a good story, you're going to let it take you wherever it goes, especially characters once you make them. You want to give them freedom to allow things to happen and go in strange and bizarre directions and so on, until your wife tells you that you can't do that. No. But I tend to think of both myself and the readers as wanting a good story. Certainly Flannery O'Connor, who, again, the Catholic, the faith thing, but in a very, dark and funny way, which is how I tend to operate. I like to write about people who can't have faith either. They're trying, but they can't do it, or they once had it and they lost it, or they lost it, now they're getting it back, whatever. She's great. I love her, and in terms of humor, I always loved Thomas Pynchon, and S.J. Perelman was a New Yorker writer. I like the New Yorker. I read the New Yorker a lot. I like the cartoons better than anything. So, well, yes, I mean, in terms of if you really feel that you are a writer, and as we already discussed, the best way to tell if you're a writer is to try and quit. But certainly if it brings pleasure to the person to write and to have people read their stuff, then I would try and arrange my life to accommodate that, and that's what life is. I mean, you're always saying, you know, should I spend time with my family or should I write? Should I make money to support my family or should I write? Your whole life will be like that. But again, the most common question I get from younger writers is, how do I know if I'm a writer? How do I know if my stuff is any good? That type of thing. And I think the easiest way to answer that question again is to just try quitting for a while and see if you can't help it. And then if you can't help it, your decision is made. You know, you're a writer. Feel sorry for you. No. You know, I don't think of it as a situation where you're saying, even though I'm getting these rejection slips, I'm still going to write because I know the way I feel is you're going to write because you can't help it. And that's why you're going to keep writing, not because of willpower or something. Although I'm sure there are people who succeed that way. Well, I have a novel coming out that I'm going to read from tonight that comes out in November called Bet Your Life, which is kind of a murder mystery. And I am doing some TV work for ABC. I have screenplays that probably won't get made. I've done several of those. So I do all different kinds of writing, and I still do writing for the firm too, because my firm in St. Louis, because they have a whole series of websites that they make for clients, and it tends to sound like lawyers wrote them, and so I take those and rewrite them for them. And it's writing, again, that I enjoy. I guess I wouldn't say I enjoy it as much as writing a novel, but I enjoy it more than any other kind of work because it's writing. So, and I guess that would, playing back into when you asked me about young writers and so on, I would look for any kind of writing to do. People tend to say, oh, I'm an artist, you know, I can't. I think, you know, you could be a good technical writer and you're going to learn a lot. You could go to law school and you're going to learn about writing too, because the best lawyers and the best clerks of judges, for instance, they don't write that you know, whither to, wherefore. They don't write like that, and that's why they succeed. So there's a lot of room, especially in this day and age, for anybody who can write at all well to get paid to write for a business, for instance. A newsletter, a newspaper, anything is going to help you hone your skills, and then you can go home later and write, you know, your novel or your poem or whatever. One of the, probably in 1998, when Brainstorm was optioned for the movies by Alan Pakula, he asked me if I wanted to do the first draft of the screenplay, which I didn't know at the time, but sometimes that's a common courtesy to ask someone. I think he thought I knew more about screenwriting than I did, and I wasn't dishonest. I told him I didn't know how to write screenplays, and he said, well, don't worry, I can teach you that in a couple weeks. And so I did decide to try it. And along the way, one of the things that he and other people suggested was that if you have a movie that you particularly admire or that started out as a book, let's say The English Patient, or in my case, I read James M. Cain, The Postman Always Rings Twice, and Double Indemnity. They're two very slender noir novels, you know, which really started that whole genre, I think, in Hollywood, and they made great movies out of them. And so you can read the Double Indemnity, let's say, as a novel, and very slender, again, only about 120 pages, about as long as a screenplay. And then you can see them, I think in that case it was Billy Wilder, you know, take that book and make it into a screenplay, and then you can read the screenplay, and then you see the movie, and perhaps you can do that twice, and then you'll start seeing this is how you take a book and make it into something visual. And I just love those books, and so I thought to myself, you know, could I write a murder mystery like this, you know, a dark, insurance investigative, murder mystery, but set it in the modern age. And so I went and talked to investigators in Omaha. There's a lot of insurance companies in Omaha, so it was very handy to go and see them and see how they work now. The cliche in the old movies is the Humphrey Bogart kind of investigator, Fred McMurray in Double Indemnity, who is kind of a gumshoe and tracks down clues and interviews people in person and that kind of thing. Well, you won't be surprised to learn that a lot of this stuff nowadays, the investigators, half their work is done with a computer. They do still go on site, but not as much anymore. But they're every bit as talented and aggressive in, detecting insurance fraud behind, say, a faked murder or fake death, or a fake car accident, or plastic surgery that's being billed as a medical condition or so on. And it was really interesting to me to see how they work. The staffs are a lot smaller now, so they have to get by with fewer people. But just that whole lifestyle of coming to work every day and having people try and cheat you all day long kind of really appealed to me. So I decided I was going to write a movie about, or a novel about insurance fraud and the people who investigate it.
Our reader tonight is Richard Dooling, whose work many of you probably know. Have you read Critical Care? Once described as the one flew over the cuckoo's nest of the ICU. Dooling has worked in an ICU as a respiratory therapist. Have you read White Man's Grave, a finalist for the National Book Award in 1994? Dooling has worked as a lawyer and has traveled to places he writes about. Have you read or seen Brainstorm, a novel about neuroscience in the criminal courts with hate crime as a focus? Dooling has worked as an employment discrimination lawyer and in a large law firm. Have you read Blue Streak, a nonfiction work on the language of swearing? Dooling has worked in these careers to support himself and his writing. Now he works as a writer of novels, screenplays, and studies of language, and other. Toward the end of Critical Care, there are some interesting lines. The ICU doctor says to the nun who is holding the hand of a dying patient, "I guess we look at the world differently." And she replies, "Do we? A teacher once told me, be careful how you look at the world. It is like that." Dooling can both write novels that thrill and give us ways of looking at the world for us to consider. Richard Dooling will read for us tonight. May I introduce Richard Dooling.
Thank you, Joanna. All of my books are different. They all start with different ideas, different characters. Sometimes it is an idea that mainly gets me going, and sometimes it's just a voice of a particular character. In this case, I think I can trace Bet Your Life, my novel that's coming out in the fall, November, from HarperCollins, back to the old film noir, Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice, when I was trying to adapt White Man's Grave and Brainstorm into screenplays for two different directors. I read those old books of James M. Cain very carefully, and then I read the screenplays that were made from them, and then of course I had seen the movies and I watched them again, and I fell in love with James M. Cain's voice, and I also fell in love with the idea of trying to write an old insurance murder mystery type novel, but set in modern times. Probably won't come as a surprise to you that in this day and age, half the work they do is with computers, so hacking and cyber sleuthing and so on obviously comes into play. The main character I'm going to be reading about for you tonight, Lenny Stillmock, is the IT person in what's called the Special Investigations Unit of a large insurance company in Omaha. That's set in Omaha, where the insurance fraud is also taking place. The problem you always have when you're trying to read from a novel is what part do you read and how do you tie those parts together. So I guess we'll focus on Lenny tonight. There are actually three main investigators. The protagonist, the classic investigator type person, is Carver Hartnett, and Lenny Stillmock is his friend who knows more about computers but is also manic depressive. I worked in the Nebraska Psychiatric Unit for 2 years after college, and my favorite patients were manic depressive patients, so I always wanted to write about one. All three of these people are probably in their late 20s, but they're all sophisticated, pretty sophisticated computer users. In the first two chapters, I'm going to start with chapter 3. In the first two chapters, basically what's established is that the main character, Carver Hartnett, is falling for Miranda, his beautiful cube-mate neighbor, but she's kind of holding him at arm's length. And Lenny sits on the other side of him, and before I start reading to you about Lenny, a number of things have happened to him. He's just been fired from his job because for something that's too difficult to go into here, but the main suspicion that Carver has is it seems blown out of proportion to the actual mistake that Lenny made, so we're unsure exactly why he was fired. They are investigating a big, huge insurance fraud outfit, and so that also seems suspicious. So at this point, Carver and Miranda are going to see Lenny in the bar, and Carver is worried that Lenny is having another manic episode because of the way he's just reacted to his boss, and his boss has responded by firing him. Miranda was right. Lenny needed commiseration. It was Friday, less than 10 shopping days till Christmas, a flatland winter grinding down to the shortest day of the year. But it would be nothing but a long, cold one for poor Lenny. Miranda and I left Reliable at 5 sharp and shoe skated on salt and gravel-dusted snowpack down to Lenny's favorite haunt, the Upstream, a brew pub and restaurant installed in a renovated old-time fire station. Lenny was at the bar chasing Bushmills with microbrews that smelled like fermented bran muffins. Nothing excessive, just the usual too much of everything. The lithium was medication for his manic depression, and I knew about that because I'd seen him toxic before. Doctors drew his blood once a month to monitor him, but I'd also seen him chop up Ritalin with a razor blade and snort it, pop Ames, do meth, anything to leaven his daily bread of smoking pot. Even the better classes in town can't escape crank out here in the Midwest, where the fields along the highways are dotted with trailer labs manned by brain-dead meth merchants cooking vats of White Cross paste for fuel and profit. One look into their eyes and you believe the time-honored maxim that addicts treat themselves. But Lenny was no speed freak. His tastes ran to pharmaceuticals and designer pot strains, sometimes ecstasy or mushrooms. In a dark room after too much wine, he'd admit to experimenting with a sterile needle or two in his college days. Moderation was a distant memory. An adolescent phase Lenny had crashed through like the sound barrier over 15 years ago, and he had no intention of regressing. Miranda brought around, and Lenny gave us the blow-by-blow on how the Dagmar had posted security outside Norton's door. Norton is the boss, old man Norton. Fake cops had escorted him back to his cube where they powered down his machine, gave him 2 cardboard boxes, and told him to clean out his space. He'd gone straight home where he tried to log onto the network and found all of his user and admin profiles had been deleted. In 2 hours, he'd gone from a guy with root privileges on the servers to a stranded J-random hacker with revoked network privileges. The cyber equivalent of the detective in a bad movie, surrendering his gold badge to the chief. Finding another job wouldn't be too tough. Omaha has trouble holding on to young talent, and the brains tend to drain to the coast or to Denver, Chicago, Minneapolis, or St. Louis. In the 90s, shortly after Level 3 Communications chose Denver for its headquarters instead of Omaha, Reliable Allied Trust and a lot of other local businesses hired headhunters to conduct nationwide dragnets searching for technology workers. People like Lenny and Miranda were prime targets because they had grown up in or around Omaha and so had at least one reason to come back and live in the middle of a moonscape the local paper called the Midlands, the TV stations called the Heartland, and Lenny called the Mid-Heartland. In Lenny's case, the headhunters had found him working at a San Jose electronic gaming company called City of Dis Entertainment, where he had once made good money as a senior software engineer. His depressive phases had interrupted a few key projects, and soon the talented Lenny wasn't quite cutting it when it came to competing for stock options and cash bonuses. He drifted downward at DIS until he was assigned to corporate investigations, better known around Silicon Valley as dumpster diving. He was paid to grab documents from the trash bins of his company's competitors and paw through them in search of carelessly discarded proprietary information. His bosses kept telling him that commercial espionage was perfectly legal, right up to the night Lenny had off and the cops arrested the guy who was working his shift. Lenny had been a good find for Reliable. He was already an investigator of sorts, and he had lots of technology experience, and his many personality defects rendered him not quite right on the West Coast, which meant his talents could be had for half price here in the Mid-Heartland. Lenny drained his glass of microbrew and was ready to brain dump on the subject of Norton's sphincterish behavior. But it was hard to concentrate when every stray male in the place was watching Miranda and sensing that she didn't go with me or Lenny. Lenny knew about a rave supposedly taking place in a barn on the Omaha Indian Reservation up north, reportedly safe and bust-proof because it was not on state or federal land or some other insane excuse to believe in a frontier hell's half-acre where the government couldn't arrest you for rampant poly-drug abuse. Miranda got up to use the little girl's room while all the little boys watched. Lenny waited until she was out of earshot. "Did you bring my vitamins?" he asked. I had a friend of a friend who carried Lenny's favorite brand of ecstasy, and sometimes I picked some up for him. I didn't like doing it, but he gave me unremitting shit about it if he asked for some and didn't get any. He also laughed at me when I wouldn't take money from him for the pills. He didn't want to hear my careful rabbinical distinctions between using, sharing drugs with somebody, and dealing, selling drugs to somebody, even though the laws made the same distinctions. So every now and again, I'd pick him up some. I had 5 of them in an envelope, and I pressed them into his hand. "Don't tell our hall monitor," he said, nodding where Miranda had been. He fished one out and popped it in his mouth like a breath mint. I planned on raving whether we make it to the reservation or not. I shook my head when he offered one because I favor a fuel mix of Sensimea and the best scotch I can afford, and I wasn't in the mood for uncharted waters. Miranda could be talked into smoking pot on special occasions, but unlike Lenny, who was an expert in all forms of alcohol, Miranda was mainly a wine snob. She slithered back onto her stool and sipped a Pinot. "I'll buy you a glass of this Sainsbury," she said. "That'll cheer you up." I didn't worry about Lenny mixing Bushmills and beer and wine with ecstasy because alcohol and drugs never affected him in the normal way. His loft condo in the old market was 6 blocks from Reliable's offices. I'd gone home for lunch with him before and seen him swat shots of tequila, do bong blasts of hydro-going pot, then go back to the office where I watched him configure a secure network server, thinking in free BSD and speaking in VI. I was more worried about the mindless stunt he'd pulled in Norton's office because it meant Lenny's manic cycle could be kicking in. If so, and if the past was any guide, Lenny would soon become Napoleonic, except he'd get more done than Napoleon ever did because Napoleon slept once in a while. Lenny swallowed the rest of his wheat beer and said, I feel like harvesting an army of zombie machines and executing a tribal flood into Norton's network. Send him a Godzilla-gram thank you note. If Lenny was on his way to manic, he could manage a tribal flood in the space of an evening. During his manic phases, Lenny booked flights to Moscow, Rio, Stockholm, and Hong Kong. He wrote presidents, kings, and dictators via FedEx first overnight, stamping privileged and confidential all over the envelopes. He cabled investment brokers who had never heard of him and told them to sell the blue chips in his IRA and buy all the titanium futures they could get their hands on. He'd order 100 engraved invitations to a wine tasting party at his place tomorrow night at 6, regrets only. Then he'd mix and burn 5 custom CDs for the occasion. After that, he'd drain off a tumble of single malt, then wind down with a Whitehall Lane Merlot from his Vino Temp stand-free wine cellar, maybe recite this year's Darwin Awards while swirling his glass and swigging, tell a few code warrior lies. Later, he'd stop by Sushi Ichiban for a dragon roll and sake, then head across the river to the casinos for a drink. He'd empty his wallet at the blackjack table, make it home by about 3 a.m., and go online where he'd try to win it all back, playing Delta Strike at $100 a headshot in real money. After about a week of being the whirling dervish of on and offline Omaha, Lenny would suddenly not show up for work. His sister and his mom would open his condo with their key and take him in for crisis stabilization and partial hospitalization at the Methodist Richard Young Center, where after a lithium adjustment and some IV Valium, Lenny would take a 72-hour nap. 3 or 4 days later, he'd be back at work and worth every penny Reliable paid him. Norton knew Lenny's bipolar drills and knew he was getting Lenny at a bargain rate because of it. Miranda moved away from someone who was smoking, and she seemed distracted and ticked off, probably at Norton. I could tell she thought Lenny was being shot at dawn for not using his napkin, and maybe she and I would be next if we picked up the wrong fork. We tossed back what was left around, too, and the bartender put a 6-pack of Coronas and a lime in a brown bag for us. Lenny and I raced for shotgun in Miranda's Audi and the proximity it would provide to her in the driver's seat. Of course, we'd be taking her car. She didn't like riding in other people's cars or staying in other people's houses. She never said a word about it. She just always ended up driving. And if we went anywhere for late-night drinks and small talk, it was her place. Every now and again, after 3 or 4 drinks, she'd let me touch her. When that happened, I had to move fast, because an hour later, she'd be in bed, alone. What happens now is they leave the bar and they try to go to the rave, but they get a phone call that the tribal police, this actually happened. There was a rave up, I read about the paper, I may have read about it a couple years ago, and the tribal police busted the rave, and so they call them and tell them, so they turn around, and Lenny is getting more and more manic, and he talks Miranda into taking him to the casinos, where, I mean, he's a gambling addict along with being a manic depressive. He loses $5,000, make a long story short. It looks like he's going to win $5,000 in this protracted series of blackjack hands, but ultimately he loses, and everyone kind of just quietly moves away from him, and then Miranda and Carver have to take him home. When they do, they drop him off, and he makes one cryptic remark before he goes into his apartment, something to the effect, I scorn debts, either they will go away or I will. And then he walks into his apartment. And they both look at each other, so they kind of resolve to just call him later and make sure he's okay and so on, because by that point he's kind of drunk and a little bit of everything else. So they go home, and Miranda drives Carver back to his apartment because he doesn't have his car. It's in the shop. They have a moment outside the place. Carver goes in his apartment, and on his machine is Lenny wanting to play some online game. And they do play this game, which is kind of a combination of Delta. There's a real game called Delta Force and another one called Counter-Strike. I've never played them, but I've watched people do it, and it was just... I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They're the shoot 'em up, you know. So in the course of this game, though, something very strange happens, because Carver plays this game enough that he can tell that it's not Lenny on the other end anymore. It's somebody else. And he doesn't know what that means. And the only thing it says when it's over is somebody else's name, handle, I win. Like that's what he gets when he gets off the phone. Carver calls him. He gets the answering machine. Lenny also has a webcam that's always on in his apartment, and he tries to log on there, and that's off. So he resolves to, call him a little later. He sits down on the couch and falls asleep. 3 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings, and it's Miranda, and she's worried about Lenny. Now they're both worried about Lenny. She doesn't want to go over there by herself. She comes and gets Carver, and they go down there to see if Lenny's okay. I think I got everything. We buzzed Lenny from his entryway, but he wasn't answering. Miranda stabbed the touchpad with her thumb and pleaded with him under her breath. "Come on, Lenny." I wanted to think that Lenny had a bankroll stashed somewhere and had gone back across the river to wager it all on a comeback. But I knew he didn't have a crying dime to his name, and we both knew something was wrong. Better take a water break. "Maybe I should call his sister," I said. "She has a key." Miranda opened her purse and yanked out a chain of keys and smart cards. She grabbed a key rimmed in red plastic and stabbed it in the lock, cranked the deadbolt open with a fluency plainly acquired by practice. Before I could ask her about it, she was banging her clogs on the metal stairs, running up to Lenny's place, cursing him through her clenched teeth, leaving me behind to wonder why she had a key, and more important, why she didn't want me to know she had a key. I took the stairs 2 at a time and caught up with her at the door to Lenny's loft, where she used a second key, this one rimmed in green, to unlock another deadbolt. The steel door groaned when it swung open, sounding just like those squawky doors in a game of Delta Strike. Sometimes you enter a room and life starts over in an alien place, where all the old rules, habits, and assumptions are useless. A place that makes you agree with the philosophers who say that the pleasures of this world are nothing more than the torments of hell seen backwards in a mirror. Or worse, that this world is just another planet's hell. You step off a plane in a third world country run by an authoritarian junta, or you ride a transit beam to another galaxy where the hatch of the excursion module opens and you are disgorged onto the blasted heath of hell. A place so evil, the temperatures approach absolute zero and superconductivity kicks in. Your dead best friend's condo, where you find him in his boxers, frozen in a half crouch over the keyboard, his head tilted against the computer monitor, chin settled on the back of his crumpled right fist. A travesty of Rodin's The Thinker with monitor and keyboard. A tableau done in cooling white meat. Miranda stifled a gag reflex and sketched a sign of the cross, then dry heaved and coughed into Lenny's wastebasket. Movies condition us to expect that evil is usually accompanied by a maelstrom of clamor and bloodshed. But Lenny's place was a cone of silence, with evil inscaped an inch thick until it deadened the acoustics like tapestries, and all we could hear was the blood thrumming in our ears. The only dead bodies I'd seen were in institutions where the liberal use of narcotics and sedatives had gentled my grandparents into perpetual night. Lenny's was the first corpse I'd encountered in the wild, as it were. But when I saw the bloodless marmoreal pallor of his profile, I knew just what to do. Nothing. His lips were colorless, eyes flat and lusterless, fingernails white as bones. His complexion was almost translucent, like mother of pearl, where I could peer inside his purpling interiors and almost see myself lying next to him on the bier, derogate, stone deaf to all elegies, blind to bosoms heaving with grief and tendresse for us, the dead guys. Miranda covered her face with her hands, but her eyes were transfixed, staring through the webwork of her fingers, unable to look away. "Lenny," I yelled, and moved toward him as if maybe I'd think of something to do on the way. He'd been dead long enough for his blood to settle, and somewhere midway down his torso, the waxy whiteness of his head and neck shaded to blue and purple, like the bleeding edge of a bruise darkening all the way down below his knees, where the gravity of oxygen-poor blood had turned his naked feet the color of hell's violets. It was past horrible, but I tried not to be too concerned. He couldn't be dead. 6 hours ago, he was doubling down with $1,000 chips, leering at beautiful women and puckering up to a single malt. If anybody could take you to school, give you a facial, pull a sick gimmick like making you think he was dead, it was Lenny. He was clever enough to pull off just about anything, but not dead. He couldn't be. I was expecting a big giggle, a sound clip, or a note on his chair asking us how he liked his new wax dummy. Some explanation other than death would appear any second. It was just a matter of being patient and not panicking. While I waited, I admired Lenny's new high-end gaming mouse, a Razer Boomslang 3000, looking like a little sleek Batmobile idling, ready to roar away on the fiber optic freeway. When there's nothing to be done, people often do something, because nature and human nature alike abhor vacuums. And nothing sucks the air out of a room like death. I had the useless idea that Lenny's body should be lowered to the floor, and Miranda decided that this was an emergency. So she called 911. I lifted Lenny by the shoulders and saw that his nose had bled on his hands and the keyboard. Not a lot of blood, just the kind of thing you might get after. Then I saw the hand mirror on his computer desk piled with tiny snowbanks of purple powder, a razor blade, a rolled-up diskette label. He'd left all his dollar bills at the casino. Pill vials, some with pills and labels, some with neither. They reminded me of the one time I said to him, "I hope somebody besides you is keeping track of all those pills." And Lenny had blown me off. "I was born with scrambled neurochemistry," he had said. 100 years ago, I would have been Lizzie Borden or Jack the Ripper. But thanks to lithium and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I'm just a slack master named Lenny Stillmont. Guys like me need a friendly doctor, somebody who keeps up with neuropharmacology and better living through chemistry. Miranda was behind me, giving the 911 operator the address and answering questions I couldn't hear. "What do you mean, how do we know?" she said. "He's not breathing, he's not moving, he's dead." I put one of my hands under the nape of his neck and the other under his right thigh, lifted him out of the office chair and lowered him to the floor. I arranged him in a supine position, aligned his tattooed arms and his plum-colored legs. "Fuck, Lenny," I said. So far, it was indeed a sick joke, and it just kept going with no punchline. My face burned and tears drabbled onto his naked chest. When I moved to center his head and close the eyelids over his unnerving stare, I heard Miranda gasp and stop talking on the phone. I looked up at her. She had covered the phone with her hand. "Don't touch his blood," she said. Horror and grief raveling her face. She held out her hand to stop me. "Don't touch his blood. And then she talked again into the phone to the 911 operator. "We don't know how long. He was dead when we got here." The word blood was like she had yanked the chain on a bare light bulb in a dark cellar, and the luciform glare of revelation fell on Lenny's carcass. His remains looked like something left by Satan the predator, who had ambushed Lenny, had fallen upon him in the dead of night, and stripped him of the magic pelt of life. Nothing left but a body bag of skin and bones, forlorn in fallen flesh. He'd always been skinny, not sickly, just too thin. And 6 months ago, he went through a phase where he looked certifiably anorexic. But we both attributed his weight loss to his cravings for what he called S&M, substances and medications, which he was more fond of than nutrition. "Lenny has AIDS," said Miranda. She was looking at me, but talking into the phone. "Yes, HIV positive." Now Miranda was off the phone, shuddering next to me, the two of us looking down at Lenny. "He didn't tell anybody," she said, "unless he had to. He wasn't sick with it yet, but he was HIV positive." How do you, I began. She pulled strands of her hair away from her chin where they'd stuck in flecks of saliva. She wiped her mouth on the sleeve of her leather jacket. She shook her head. "It wasn't that long ago that he found out he was positive," she said. "I don't think he knew for sure how he got it." I scanned the pill vials again. Lithium, Celexa, Ritalin, Percocet, OxyContin, blah, 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 on down the line. No names I didn't recognize. No Crixivan or Viracept. Nothing that looked like the stuff you'd take if you had AIDS. I'd seen stray pill vials aplenty around his place over the years, but I'd never seen so many together in one place. Never noticed the doctor's name before either. The same on every vial. Raymond Gutman, M.D. My ears rang with silence and burned with shame as I took a moment to consider whether I might have accidentally swapped blood with him on the basketball court, passing a joint, sharing a razor. What about the time he sliced open his hand when we were splitting firewood at his mom's? He was a mess of blood, and I'd helped him clean the wound with peroxide. We heard sirens, and Miranda shook harder on her way to a full-blown grand mal of grief and terror. I heard a beep and looked at Lenny's monitor, which must have come out of sleep mode when I moved his hands on the keyboard. His screen slowly brightened like dawn breaking on the frozen plains of a new world naked, where Lenny's browser had several sessions open. The windows on top were all XXX, being dished up by a server off in some infernal cyberspace basement, and behind it, the map still loaded from the Delta Strike game we had played. Only half of the man-machine hybrid named Lenny Stillmock was dead. The other half was still up and running. AIDS, Lenny? He'd never acted gay. And the porn on the screen was plainly hetero, so maybe he was bi or gay, a double agent and master of deception. Or maybe those needles he played with in college weren't really sterile. Or his number came up, like the time he'd won $12,000 at the tables over at Harrah's and had celebrated by saying yes to a hooker. Window number 3 was a chat session open on his desktop with the Attila at Home webcam commander running for a net meeting. The incoming video was dark and blank. If someone had had a camera going on the other side, that someone was gone now. When I glanced up and saw Lenny's Intel Pro PC camera mounted on the top rim of his monitor, its glass eyes staring right back at me, a tiny red light under the lens on the base blinking red. The Attila at Home webcam was on and transmitting. "Turn it off," Miranda cried. I wasn't sure if she meant turn off the porn or if she was tracking with me. Namely, maybe somebody was on the other side of that camera, watching. Maybe they'd been watching when Lenny had, "Turn it off," she yelled. She reached under his desk, grabbed the power strip, and started yanking out the plugs to the backup power supply, the webcam, the monitor, the machine. "Miranda," I said, "don't. You want somebody seeing him like this? You want that garbage on the screen when the ambulance gets here?" I looked up again at the dark monitor and listened to the hard disk and the cooling fan spin down, realizing that if somebody had been there watching when Lenny died, any trace of the onlooker was probably evaporating from volatile memory, unless one of Lenny's programs had kept a visitor's log. I heard Miranda sobbing and calling Lenny's name, but the stillness of his body seemed to soak up words before I could hear them. "Carver, the ambulance is coming. The cops, the EMTs. What do we tell them?" I looked at Lenny and the pill vials and the tiny rows of powder on the mirror. It didn't occur to me there was much to tell. It was just a beautiful idea named Lenny being desecrated and mutilated by gangs of ugly facts. Are we just going to let them find all this that he was taking? Tell them what he was doing? She glanced in horror again at the monitor. What about his mom? The newspaper? "It's over," I said. "We can't make it look any different than it is." I heard voices and footfalls on the metal stairs. So, kind of a combination of horror and I never made a character that I liked